It's just a culture within itself where there is this elevated acceptance that if we do more, we get more. I think sometimes when we think about money, when it equates to time, we don't value time nearly as much as we value the dollar. I know that there's a huge story involved in all this, but you were kind of like running the rat race, triple booking, doing all the things on the road, running a salon, for crying out loud. Andrew Carruthers, who is the founder and coach of the Journeyist, amazing educator, so much background and experience. Andrew, how's it going?
So good. I love to tell stories, and this could really easily turn into an hour and a half.
We love stories, though. I mean, that's the kind of the reason why with this season, I really wanted to make it about the storytelling piece, because that's so much of what runs into the veins of our business. And the closer we can get to that story piece, the easier it is for us to translate and to attract the right people. If you wouldn't mind just maybe starting with, how did you get started in the industry and where did your journey begin?
Like there was kind of a group of us that I feel like had a really similar path in the late 90s, early 2000s as a hairdresser. And it was a lot of us that were failed rock stars.
I love that. All the fallen rock stars. Okay.
Yeah, there was honestly like a group of, I think, 5 or 6 of us just in Salt Lake City that I knew that, our big dream was to be out in a touring band and all that kind of stuff. And it didn't work out. And I really had no idea the potential within the beauty industry to basically be a rock star. So I lived in Salt Lake City. I tried working at a recording studio. I did sound for clubs at night and things like that, trying to make it in the music industry. And it was just killing me. It was actually even killing my passion for music because it was so challenging. And my sister was a hairdresser and still is a hairdresser, actually. And I would watch that, she would have these people come in, they would sit in her chair and they'd have a blast. They'd just be like old friends having fun, like we're doing right now, just telling stories. And then she would do something artistic and they would hand her money at the end. And I was like, okay, well, this seems like a pretty cool job. I think I might be into this. So I talked to her about it. In Salt Lake City at that point, you could still apprentice to do hair. You didn't have to go to hair school. And she was like, if you could find someone to apprentice you to do hair, that would be so cool. So I found this guy named Tyson Daniel. He had just opened a new salon. And, especially in that kind of late 90s era, having a salon full of straight men was kind of a rarity. Like it was kind of cool, right? And so he had just opened the salon, and it was like him and this guy David, and they were kind of like the 2 hot straight guys that did all the models' hair,
Sounds terrible.
Oh my gosh, it was so funny. I walk in, and there's like techno music just blasting in this salon, just like, and they're all dressed super cool, and they just looked badass. And I was like, okay, this is not what I was expecting. And it was perfect timing because Tyson was looking for an apprentice at that point. I got to pretty much jump right in at that point, and he was the regional education director for TG. So he introduced me to teaching like right off the bat. I was out teaching product knowledge classes for TG before I even had a hair license. Wow. So that was the big intro to the beauty industry and like the potential of it. And also that first taste of education.
Do you mind if we talk a little bit about how you became an educator for Zambia and kind of where that took you on the road and what that was like?
Yeah. So kind of the Cliff Notes version to take us up to that point. I did work with TG for a little bit. I left that salon because Tyson and I weren't getting along at that point. But I started to work for Lunatic Fringe, and my good friend Dennis James, who at the time was working there, he was helping to start the Paul Mitchell School's advanced education team. So he gave me an opportunity to jump onto that team. So I worked with Paul Mitchell Advanced Education for quite a few years. Got super burned out on just traveling and teaching and all that kind of stuff because I was still trying to maintain a full-time clientele. Almost left the industry completely, started to train as a life coach. And that was kind of late 2000s. So by 2010, I started to take on more of like a life coach role. And plus, that was also when I started to look at it buying into one of the locations of the salons that I was working with. And so I became a salon owner. I was doing coaching on the side. And then all of a sudden, here comes the Samvia crew into my life. And that's where I connected with the Samvia crew is through our friend Geneva Cowan, who passed away a few years ago. But she connected us. And it was actually through my wife, of all things, kind of a long story, but through a photo shoot, Geneva met my wife, who did wardrobe for photo shoots. And my wife was like, "Oh, you should meet my husband Andrew. Like, he does hair too, and he does coaching and stuff." And she's like, "Oh, cool. I want to meet him." And we got super tight, super close. And she's like, "I think you need to meet Samvia." I was like, "Okay, I've heard of this guy quite a bit. I'd like to meet him."
Yeah.
And that's where that kicked off.
I think talking about the world of burnout it's a very relevant hot button right now. Mm-hmm. But where do you think that hustle mentality to climb faster comes from in our industry?
I think it's just this. When we look back at kind of the history of the hairdressing world, hairdressers were not, especially here in the United States, were not considered to be high-end people within our community. It was sort of the joke job that you would go and get if you couldn't do something else. Oh, you're going to do hair. Oh, that's sweet. That's nice. You know, the beauty school dropout kind of story. And so, especially in the late 90s period, you were starting to see some growth. Like, I think things were starting to shift. You know, Tyson and David were charging quite a bit more than most of the other people and actually getting away with it because they were having better services, a higher kind of image quality within the store. But still, in comparison, if you look at it hour for hour, they still weren't making crap in relationship to other people doing other types of jobs and working just as hard with similar levels of education and experience. It was still low pay. So the way that hairdressers were taught to make a good living was to show up at 8:00 in the morning, triple book themselves, and work themselves till midnight. And it started to become this badge of honor to walk into the break room the next morning and go, "Oh my gosh, guys, you should have seen it. I was triple booked for 14 hours. I didn't even eat all day. I didn't drink a single sip of water. And I went out and partied all night last night. And I'm still here." Like, that was really kind of the culture of the hair industry. And I think in some places it still is.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a big part of it, is that from very early on, the picture that's painted within the hair industry is you really have to work so insanely hard to make a good living. And if you do that, you can kind of wear it as this, you know, Superman cape of like, look how hard I work, look how bad I grind myself down. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from.
It's just a culture within itself where there is this elevated acceptance that if we do more, we get more. And the get more, we don't think about, well, what are we losing in return, or what are we trading? And so I think sometimes when we think about money, when it equates to time, we don't value time nearly as much as we value the dollar. And so we have an image in our mind, because I talk to hairstylists all the time, and even salon owners that are still hairstylists behind the chair. And there is a number that we cap off, or we get uncomfortable with it. And everyone has a different range within it. And that's something that's more psychological. That's a personal thing. So, and I do find that it's more prevalent with creatives, with artists. And so that falls on the shoulders of the hairstylist. And when we're not predominantly business or entrepreneur savvy people, and you throw us in the wrenches with the rest of kind of the way the culture has been built, and then you kind of like top it off with that sweet little cherry on top of our own insecurities and imposter syndromes, and it creates like the perfect storm. So I know that there's a huge story involved in all this, but you were kind of like running the rat race, triple booking, doing all the things on the road, running a salon, for crying out loud. Did you have a break point, or what helped you decide to focus a little bit more heavily on one over the other?
I took on the position of They called me the artistic director when I was working with Paul Mitchell Advanced Education. And when I did that, I kind of didn't realize how much of a shift in responsibility that was going to be. Because like you said, at this point, I was still pretty much behind the chair full time. And, for those of you that aren't in the hair industry listening to this, full time is 60 hours a week. It's not 40. Like right. Hairdressers work ridiculous hours. So, I'm working like 9, 10 o'clock in the morning until like 10 o'clock at night. Saturday, I'm getting off at, maybe 4 or 5 in the afternoon, catching a flight somewhere, teaching a class on Sunday, maybe on Monday too, flying home Monday night. My first client's at 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning. When I was doing that once a month, because when I was just working as more of as an educator for Paul Mitchell the schools, that was happening like once a month maybe. Then it started to become 2 or 3 times a month when I took on that artistic director role, because I had to be at every event. Even if I wasn't teaching at the event, I needed to be present at it. It didn't take long. I honestly think, I don't even know if I made it a full year after I took on that position. And I got so burned out. Luckily, I had a life coach, Lynn Christian from Soul Salt, at that point, and she helped me to recognize, okay, you are in full burnout at this point. So we really need to figure out, what are we going to do here? And that's when we started to look at the potential of, well, what else could I parlay my interests and my experiences and things like that into? Because at that point, I didn't want to look at a pair of shears. I didn't want to look at a bowl of color. I did not want to look at a head of hair. People would be like, oh, don't look at my hair, it's a mess, when they'd see me at the grocery store. I'd be like, trust me, the last thing I'm looking at right now is your freaking hair. Like, I don't even want to think about hair right now.
Oh, man.
But luckily, working through that with my coach, we helped to recognize that the burnout wasn't about the industry. It was about my over dedication of time and focus to one thing. There was a podcast I listened to, Win Claybaugh, who owns Paul Mitchell Schools. He has this podcast called, well, it's not a podcast, it's actually a interview series called The Masters. And on one of the Masters, I always forget who it was, but the gentleman said something to the effect of, burnout doesn't happen from working hard. It comes from doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I think that that's what I had to realize, is it wasn't necessarily the beauty industry. It wasn't even teaching. It wasn't even doing hair that burned me out. It was doing all of that with such an intensity and such a repetitive process. That's what burned me out. Like, we just can't survive that for too long. It doesn't matter. I do have friends that did live their dream and play in bands. And 5-6 years into that, they are so burned out, especially if they make it big and they're touring constantly. It just tears you apart. You could, they're doing something they love and they're still getting torn apart.
That's a valid point. I didn't even think of it that way. When I think of burnout, I just think of trying to juggle too many things and getting overwhelmed. Like, I just think of extreme overwhelm, but that could just be more anxiety based than it would be necessarily burnout. I remember you and I were talking actually backstage a couple years back, and you were telling me about the Journeyist and what made you decide that this is really kind of your next calling in this stage of life. And it's been really cool to be your friend on the outside and seeing how you're able to bring something different, not just to our industry, but I guess to even creatives alike. And that's something that I think sews our friendship together, is you're focusing on the internal process. And, just even listening to one of your breath work exercises and how that's made a change in my life. I want to focus the rest of this podcast on kind of like how you were led to this part, and what you're doing moving forward with it.
Tying back to the burnout period, one of the things that my coach Lynn had developed is this thing called the Hedgehog Project. And she called it the Hedgehog Project because hedgehogs have a very unique defense mechanism, which is to roll themselves up in a little spiny ball, a very cute little spiny ball.
It's adorable, yes.
And so it's very similar to the Japanese ikigai, which is if you take what you're passionate about, what your strengths are, where there's a need in the world, and some place to connect all that with a financial opportunity, that's your hedgehog, because all of those things are meeting together. And it's like, hey, this is a place that you are very specialized because everything kind of adds up to the same place for you personally. So it's the idea of how do I find that place that's so specific for me? And coaching kept coming up. Specifically, the fact that my entire life, I've kind of had this interest in the more esoteric things in life, the more ethereal, the more spiritual. But I've always seen it also through the lens of practicality too. Like it can get as woo-woo as you want, but I sort of need there to be something that grounds it in practicality or something that grounds it in something I can feel or identify. And so when Lynn first introduced me to coaching, she sort of had that approach to coaching because she focused really heavily on intuition and developing people's intuition. But then she also had a very scientific, almost therapy-based mindset with it too, which had very specific processes. So I was like, wow, this is really cool because this totally works with me. I love the kind of structured, very scientific, very practical. But I also loved this very spiritual and very ethereal and esoteric aspect. Lynn had gone to, after I started to train with her, she actually trained me to become a coach. And she went to this training in New Zealand. And it was multiple brain integration techniques is what she went to learn. And she came home and she's like, Andrew, this thing was built for you. I mean, it couldn't be more perfect. Because wow. Grant Suslu, who developed it with Marvin Oka, they had come from this group. And this group is very head brainy. It's very, and everything it does have a great scientific foundation behind it. But what they recognized is that there were so many esoteric wisdom traditions that had talked about things like, the chakra systems and, these different things that we've all heard of. And they're like, well, I think there's a connection that we're missing here. Like we're missing the esoteric aspects of that the body has intelligence too. Not just the head, not just the mind. So they've really dove deep into so many different wisdom traditions and started to develop this process called multiple brain integration techniques, which scientifically we recognize that there are the same neural structures within the heart and within the gut that happen within the head brain and actually other places within the body too. But those scientifically, we're getting lots of attention in the last 20 or 30 years. Like the gut brain is something that most of you have probably heard of at this point because it's very popular. So they actually really built out the scientific aspect, but also built a practice so that we can start to connect to what is that wisdom that we all have within the heart of compassion and connection? What is that deep set wisdom that when we go, well, my gut is telling me this, or my gut is telling me that, what does that actually mean? And how do we connect to it? And so that guided kind of breathwork journey that you took, that was pretty much a multiple brain integration process.
This is something that's new for me personally. And I think just even taking those 10 minutes to focus on those pieces and to practice that it's almost kind of like, when we want to have the answer to everything and to walk into something and not search for any answers, only just to see what comes forward is such a new revelation for me. And being in my 40s and just discovering that, I feel like I want to pass it on to people who are kind of going through the trenches or in a position that they feel like they're stuck in, or they feel like they don't have support. Because I will say that even though I've had struggles throughout my career or journey in life, I will say I've always had the support of others around me. And I've been fortunate enough to say that, and not everyone can. So I feel like having something like this that you can do in your own space and your own privacy and your own body is something that I want more people to know of. And I want, them to experience that. I approached you a couple of weeks ago and I said I had an opportunity to do something, and I just wasn't really sure if that was something that sat well with me or that I wanted to do, that I was aligned to, because I think the ego was saying, oh my gosh, I'm so flattered that you want me for this situation, not that this is the best situation for me moving forward. What sort of advice do you give somebody like that is just not really sure where the answer is? They don't know what their gut is telling them. It's so easy to get confused by the head, heart, and gut.
Yeah, it is. And it's tough because from a greater societal sort of aspect, we have really been taught to only use our head brain. Hey, think about it. You got to take the emotion out of it. All of these things that we were taught were really specifically teaching us to specifically rely on logic to do the work. Yeah. And logic is only one aspect of our intelligence. It's a very important aspect of our intelligence. Like our head brain is incredibly powerful, and used in the right way, it is a beautiful support system. However, if we try to just logic everything to death, we are going to find ourselves quite lost at times. I want to kind of come back to something that you said, which is we don't have to wait for burnout to do this. And I think a lot of times what ends up happening is the reason that we can't connect to a heart-based intelligence, like our values, the things that we value so deeply, that's a heart-based intelligence. If I have never taken the time to actually sit down and say, well, what do I value?
Yeah.
I'm not going to go to that place naturally when I start to have these types of inquiries that come up, like, hey, should I take this job? I know you said that you're kind of new to it, but I think just knowing you, I think you have a natural intuitive sense to you. And I think even when you reached out to me at first, I could hear it coming through, this kind of intuitiveness that maybe this isn't really what I want. And even what you just said, that you started to think, well, what if this is my ego? I think that was an intuitive hit. That's what intuition is. It's the knowing without us knowing. It's that feeling that it comes forward really loud and proud and strong, but we go, I'm going to logic this right back out of myself.
Right.
We call it a neural integration constraint, which is the head brain wants to overtake the intelligence of the gut. The intelligence of the gut is really rich, but it's also really subtle. It doesn't tend to come out like the head brain. When we tell ourselves stories in the head brain, that's where story comes from, is in the head brain. And when we do that, we make it real vivid, don't we? Yeah. We have a beginning, we
Absolutely.
have a middle, we have an ending point. Yeah. We can see it. We know what conversations are going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we build up that story brilliantly. The gut doesn't do that. It just knows. It just is a sense. It's a felt sense of truth. And that's more subtle. And so it's harder for us to tap into if we don't do that on a regular basis. So the reason I'm kind of setting that up is one of the things I'd highly recommend is some type of practice each day that just gets you connected to your body. And it can be as simple as exactly what you just said, Ambrosia, which is just sit and breathe with no purpose. Because this is why people don't like these types of practices is they want something from it.
Mm-hmm.
I need to meditate because I want less stress. I promise you, if you start meditating just because you want to feel less stressed, you're probably going to hate meditation, because especially the first couple days of sitting and just being present with your thoughts is probably going to make your anxiety even worse for a bit. But if we sit with only the purpose to just be present with ourselves, present with what we feel, present with what we sense, and that's the only purpose we have, what you're doing is you're starting to tune in to intelligences that you've probably ignored for a long time. Because just like you experienced as you sat there and just took the 10 minutes to just do some breath, and with that recording, you have someone guiding you through it, but you do start to sense something different within your body. So even if you're not currently in a place that it's like, I need to make this decision, or I need to tap into this gut intelligence or my heart wisdom, just start taking a few minutes. And first thing in the morning is great, because it's just kind of setting up the day in the right direction. And again, don't want or need anything from it. Just sit and do a body scan for like 5 minutes. Just go from the tip of your head, just go down through your neck, down through your shoulders, down through like the heart and chest area, down into your belly. And all you need to do is just take notice to how it feels. You don't need answers. You don't need pictures. You don't need words. I would guess that after a couple days, those things actually probably will start to come forward a bit. But the less you expect of it, the better it becomes.
Andrew, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for sharing this. I feel like this was just a small introduction for people. I really want to give you guys something to kind of think about for a second, and take a step away from your business, take a step from the processes that you're going through daily, and just check in with yourself. I want you to dream big, set goals, take action, and I look forward to chatting with you next week. Take care.